The rain had started before dawn, thick and cold, turning the red clay path into a sludge-filled trench that swallowed boots and erased tracks, soaking uniforms to the bone until they clung like second skin, suffocating and heavy. Master Sergeant Elijah Cole, age 62, lay chest down in the cold filth, every inch of his lean frame coated in mud, camouflage paint smudged across his weathered face, the wrinkles at his eyes lost beneath streaks of wet earth. His breath shallow, controlled, timed with the gusts of wind that rattled the bare branches overhead. War had returned to the Central Highlands. Only this time it wasn't Vietnam, it was a fictional but all too real conflict along the border of Rantana, a once peaceful nation plunged into chaos by an uprising backed by an aggressive neighboring power. Elijah hadn't been called back as a soldier. Officially, he was a volunteer advisor, a relic of the past, pulled out of retirement for his terrain expertise and survival training, a man of maps and forgotten trails. But when the unit he was accompanying was ambushed 2 nights ago, leaving 4 men dead and the rest scattered, he shed that label and returned to what he'd always been, a survivor. Now, alone but not broken, he lay motionless in the middle of a dirt road the enemy controlled, the same road his platoon had used before being overrun, and as the sound of boots squelching through the muck drew closer, Elijah pressed his face deeper into the mud, slowed his heartbeat, and became part of the landscape. The column was 20 strong, enemy infantry in mismatched uniforms, speaking a dialect he recognized but hadn't heard in decades, rifles slung low, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the trees for movement but never thinking to look down at what appeared to be just another corpse or carcass strewn in the debris of battle. One of them stepped within inches of Elijah's outstretched leg, paused to light a cigarette, the sulfuric snap of the match sharp in the wet air, and for one breathless second, Elijah feared the rising smoke would betray him, but the man moved on, leaving only the fading scent of tobacco and burned matchwood in his wake. Minutes stretched into hours. Frogs croaked from puddles along the roadside, birds cawed in alarm before taking flight, and still Elijah didn't move. He had crawled into position before first light, smeared himself with mud, and laid a tattered poncho partially over his back to look like a fallen pack or discarded tarp. He'd seen it work in '68 during the Tet Offensive, and it worked now, because young eyes always look for motion, not for patience. As twilight began to fall and the distant rumble of armor on gravel signaled a supply convoy rolling through, Elijah made his first real decision. He wouldn't head back to Allied lines. He'd seen the route they were using, the frequency of patrols, the shape of the tracks. He could find their base. If command knew what he did, they could plan a strike or rescue what was left of the captured. He crawled forward an inch at a time, slipping into a drainage ditch filled with black water and the stench of decay, then dragged himself beneath a fallen tree, pushing through layers of sodden leaves and half-buried roots, careful not to disturb the birds roosting in the low canopy. His knees ached, joints swollen from the cold, but the pain grounded him, reminded him that he was alive, that he still had work to do. His only weapon was a rust-stained combat knife strapped to his boot, a keepsake from his first tour, and a compact radio whose battery light flickered with unreliable hope. He didn't plan to fight, not unless he had to. He planned to watch, to learn, to return with something that could turn the tide. As darkness cloaked the hills and the enemy lights blinked to life in the valley below, Elijah climbed to a ridge overlooking the camp, belly to the earth, eyes narrowed, the scent of diesel and smoke heavy in the air, and for a long moment he just watched, memorizing routines, shifts, where the sentries stood and when they left, where the officers gathered around the glowing screens in the operations tent. Beneath him, the war buzzed with confidence, unaware that an old man in the mud had just breached its edge. A half-mile behind him, the remains of his scattered squad, Corporal Denny, Private Alvarez, and Lieutenant Ng, hid in a collapsed culvert, wounded and barely breathing, relying on him to find a way out, to bring back a plan. Elijah hadn't told them everything, only that he needed time, and when Denny asked how an old mechanic was going to outfox an army, Elijah smiled with cracked lips and said, "I've been hiding from death longer than these boys have been alive." It wasn't bravado. He'd grown up in the Dust Bowl, raised by a father who worked himself to death trying to keep a farm alive. He'd fought in Saigon and walked through minefields with nothing but instinct. He'd lost a son to cancer, buried a wife who kept the home fires burning, and built a life out of grit and grief. They'd call him outdated, irrelevant, but Elijah Cole had something they didn't. He had survived. He had become invisible. Now, in the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel, he noted a flickering weak point in the enemy's perimeter, a blind spot where 2 spotlights failed to overlap. He crawled forward, counting steps by feel, by memory, tracing the ground like a tracker, pressing himself into ditches when vehicles passed, never rising more than a few inches. At one point, a stray dog barked in his direction and a guard came to check, flashlight beams sweeping dangerously close, but Elijah lay still, covered in wet leaves and sludge, not even daring to blink. The beam moved on. He exhaled. By midnight, he had reached the base's perimeter, crouched in shadow behind a supply crate, hearing the murmur of voices on the other side of the wire. The base wasn't just a camp, it was a relay point, a communications hub, with uplinks, generators, and trucks marked with foreign insignias. He counted 3 anti-aircraft guns, 2 fuel trucks, and at least 1 encrypted terminal being used by a pair of officers with heavy accents. It was more than he had hoped to find, and more dangerous. One misstep, one snapped twig, and he'd be a ghost with no one to bury him. But if he could get back and report this, maybe the airstrike would come, or maybe reinforcements would intercept the next convoy and save his men. A rustle to his right made him freeze. 2 guards were approaching, speaking softly. Elijah tucked himself behind a broken generator, the acrid tang of fuel sharp in his nose. The men paused just feet away, laughing about something, one of them lighting a cigarette, the glow momentarily illuminating the lines in Elijah's mud-caked face, but they never looked down. The moment passed. He knew now that he could get in and out if he timed it right, but he would need help to escape, and the others were still too weak to move. That meant creating a distraction, something big, something that would buy them enough time to flee. He would have to go back, draw up a plan, and lead them out himself. As he began the long crawl back up the ridge, his muscles screaming, Elijah thought of something his wife used to say during storms on the farm. Don't curse the rain. That's when the roots get strong. In the mud, in the dark, with the odds stacked high against him, he smiled. By the time Elijah Cole slithered back to the culvert where the others lay hidden beneath a web of torn canvas and fallen stone, the cold had sunk into his bones like rust into old steel, and his joints felt every one of his 62 years, but his mind was burning bright with purpose. The 3 surviving men, Lieutenant Ng, young but sharp, Private Alvarez, barely conscious from a leg wound, and Corporal Denny, skeptical and angry, looked up as he emerged from the shadows, more ghost than man, soaked in mud and stinking of diesel. He wasted no time. "They're 2 hills down, just past the ridge," he whispered, kneeling beside Ng, who had been trying to clean Alvarez's wound with bottled water and rags. "Relay station. Vulnerable spot in their lights. I got within 20 feet. We don't have days. We've got tonight." Denny snorted. "And we're supposed to do what? March in with sticks and rocks." Elijah locked eyes with him, his voice low and firm. "We won't march in. We'll slip in. And we're not fighting. We're escaping. I just need your trust." Silence. Rain ticked on the culvert like a metronome of war. Then Ng gave a nod, slow and grim. "We'll follow your lead." That was all Elijah needed. He began sketching lines in the mud with a twig, drawing a crude map from memory. Patrol paths, generator locations, the blind spot in the perimeter, the timing of guard rotations. He explained that the weak point in their fence was covered by 2 towers whose lights didn't quite meet, leaving a 20-second window every patrol cycle. They would move during the shift change, when guards were distracted and lights were rotating. But to give themselves a real chance, they needed a distraction, one big enough to divert attention from the outer perimeter. Elijah had seen barrels of fuel near a row of trucks. He would go back, rig a slow burn using engine oil, wire, and a spark timer made from a broken wristwatch he still wore. The fire would light up near the motor pool just as the team crawled through the wire, all eyes turned to the blaze. Denny frowned. "You're gonna waltz into their supply yard and start a bonfire? Alone?" Elijah met his sarcasm with calm. "I won't waltz. I'll crawl. And I've lit fires in the rain before. Learned that back when I was feeding a stove with wet wood in a Kansas winter." The memory was soft but steel-edged, and it hung in the air for a moment before they moved to prepare. They used strips of cloth from their shirts to fashion makeshift slings for Alvarez, who couldn't walk without screaming. Elijah reinforced his muddy poncho, tucked his knife tighter into his boot, and pocketed a coil of wire, 2 matchbooks, and the broken watch whose second hand still ticked, though the face was cracked. He moved out alone again before midnight, the others hunkered down and watching from the ridge. The crawl was slower now. Every movement had to be silent, precise, and every gust of wind was both cover and curse. He reached the outer wire, waited for the lights to sweep past, and slithered through the gap like a shadow leaking through a crack in a door. Near the barrels, he found old wires and a half-burned rag, enough to rig his device. He dripped oil onto a trail of cloth, set the spark to delay using the watch's ticking gears, and whispered a prayer not because he needed divine help, but because it centered his hands. Then he was moving again, slipping back toward the perimeter, heart steady, lungs burning. The fire ignited minutes later, small at first, then hungry, licking up the sides of a parked truck as soldiers began shouting, scrambling for water, confusion spreading through the camp like brush fire in wind. From the ridge, Ing gave the signal. Elijah met them at the wire just as the guards rushed toward the blaze, their backs turned to the forest. Together, they pushed Alvarez through the gap, crawling low, Denny dragging the wounded man as Elijah and Ing guided them between shadows, using the muddy embankment as cover. At one point, a pair of guards passed within spitting distance, rifles slung and faces lit by the growing fire behind them, but they didn't look down. Elijah's heart thudded in his ears, but he kept moving, years of night patrols and escape drills guiding his every motion. They made it beyond the fence and back into the trees, but the way wasn't clear. More patrols were sweeping the hills now, radios crackling with orders, beams of light cutting across the underbrush. They ducked behind fallen logs, pressed themselves into the roots of massive trees, waited breathlessly as boots stomped past. One young guard lingered, flashlight pausing near Denny's face, but Elijah reached out and gently tapped the beam with a rock, sending it wobbling toward the trees, just enough of a diversion for the man to follow it and vanish again. They moved in silence for another hour until the road was behind them and the only sounds were wind and insects. They stopped in a ravine, Alvarez unconscious but breathing. Ing collapsed against a boulder, eyes wide with exhaustion. "We can't keep moving. Not like this." Elijah nodded. He had expected as much. That was why he had chosen this direction, toward an old village well, abandoned but still marked on outdated maps. The shaft dropped deep into the hillside, and locals used to say it connected to old mining tunnels from before the war. If they could reach it, they could hide again, maybe signal help using the radio from deep underground where the enemy wouldn't expect it. Denny helped hoist Alvarez onto Elijah's back, the old man gritting his teeth through the pain in his knees. "You sure about this?" Denny asked, his tone changed now, less mocking, more respectful. "I'm sure of one thing," Elijah replied. "No one looks for the living where only ghosts are supposed to be." They found the well before dawn, hidden beneath ivy and overgrowth, the stone rim cracked but intact. With effort, they lowered Alvarez down first, then Ing, and finally Elijah, who braced himself and descended last, his fingers gripping the rope like lifelines. Inside, the air was cold and wet, but they were out of sight, out of reach, for now. Elijah worked to seal the opening with branches and mud, masking their trail. Below, in the dark, Ing found an old service box and, with Elijah's coaxing, rigged the damaged radio to transmit a burst signal, a pattern known to allies. It might not be strong, but if anyone was listening, they'd know where to find them. They rested in shifts, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the occasional cough. Elijah lay back against the stone wall, aching in every muscle, but his mind turned over the night's events like pages in a book. He thought of his wife again, of the last letter she wrote him before cancer took her, telling him never to stop using his gifts, no matter how small the world made them seem. He remembered building a wind-powered heater from scrap in their shed, how everyone laughed until it warmed the whole block during a blackout. It wasn't about tools, it was about will. Above them, the forest moved with enemy boots. Dogs barked. Orders shouted. But they didn't find the well. Elijah knew time was short. Their signal might be picked up, or it might not. They needed one more act, one more push to make escape possible. As he drifted into uneasy sleep, he began to form the next step, a trap, a deception, a way to force the enemy to look the other way long enough for a rescue or retreat. Whatever it would take, he was ready. He wasn't done. Not yet. The stale air inside the old well was thick with a scent of mildew and rust, every breath like swallowing stone, and as Elijah Cole leaned against the rough interior wall, knees drawn tight to his chest, he could feel time pressing down on them like the tons of earth above. Hours had passed since they sent the burst transmission, and no response had come, not even static to tell them if the signal made it beyond the ridgeline. Lieutenant Ing lay on his side, coughing into a damp sleeve, his lips cracked from dehydration, while Denny sat near the well's base, sharpening a broken piece of rebar as if preparing to face death with teeth bared, and Alvarez drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever rising despite Elijah's desperate attempts to cool him with what little water they had left. The radio's dying light blinked once every few seconds, a fragile ember in the dark, and with each blink Elijah remembered a moment, a face, a lesson learned not in books or training manuals but on dirt roads and in broken homes. His mother boiling dandelions for soup during the Depression, his drill sergeant yelling about guts meaning more than bullets, his wife smiling through pain, telling him that some storms pass only when you walk into them. He knew they couldn't wait any longer. If help was coming, it wouldn't arrive in time. The enemy still hunted them, and if they stayed hidden much longer, Alvarez would die and the others wouldn't be far behind. Elijah stood, his joints popping in protest, and laid out his final plan. He would go back out alone, not to fight, but to draw the enemy away. He'd make them believe the survivors were escaping through the forest's northern pass, a route visible from the relay station, and while the enemy chased ghosts, Ing and Denny could carry Alvarez through the mining shaft that ran beneath the hill and emerged half a mile west, into friendly terrain. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but better than waiting for death underground. Denny objected at first, insisting they all move together, but Elijah shook his head. "I've got the face they don't expect. Mud and age made me invisible once. It'll work again. This time, I want them to see me just long enough to chase me." He pulled the last matchbook from his coat, tore 2 pieces of his poncho, and fashioned crude torches he could light near the northern ridge to simulate a moving column, then use his own shadow and noise to lead the pursuers farther. Ing looked at him as if memorizing his face. "You're not coming back from this, are you?" Elijah smiled, soft and sad. "Maybe not. But neither did a lot of good men before me. This is just my turn to carry the weight." He climbed the rope, each pull a test of will, and emerged into a night dense with fog and whispering wind. The forest seemed to breathe with him, alive and waiting, and he moved fast, crawling low, navigating by instinct and memory. He planted the torches near the northern overlook, dragging branches behind him to leave deliberate tracks, then lit one and held it high before ducking behind a tree. The flickering light cast dancing shadows onto the nearby hillside, figures large enough to suggest a small group on the move. Within minutes, the forest erupted with motion. Dogs barking, orders shouted in broken English, flashlights crisscrossing the trees. Elijah let the second torch burn behind him as he moved east, then doubled back west, making noise, breaking branches, and finally letting himself be seen, just once, silhouetted against the flame before darting into the brush. The enemy took the bait. Gunfire lit the night, wild and unfocused, as at least a dozen soldiers sprinted after him, shouting with urgency. Elijah ran harder than he.